June 1944. Stalag Luft III, deep in the forests of Lower Silesia, now Poland, then Nazi Germany. The sun barely breaks through the dense canopy of pines surrounding the compound. Inside the wire, American airmen pace the perimeter, their boots wearing paths in the sandy soil. They've been shot down over occupied Europe, plucked from burning bombers, parachuted into enemy territory. They expected torture. They expected starvation. They expected the full weight of Nazi brutality to come crashing down on them. What they found instead would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemy. This is the story of Stalag Luft III, where the men who fought in the skies discovered that up there, among the clouds and contrails, they shared something their governments could never take away. A code, an understanding, a respect that transcended the madness below. But on one particular day in June 1944, that respect would be tested in a way no one could have predicted. A German guard would risk everything to share 4 words that would change the war, 4 words that could get him executed, 4 words that gave desperate men hope. This is that story. Lieutenant Robert Neary's B-17 had been hit over Schweinfurt. He remembers the moment with crystalline clarity even decades later. The flak burst beneath them, a black flower of death blooming in the sky. The aircraft shuddered. Metal screamed. Fire erupted from the number 3 engine. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm despite the chaos. Bail out. Bail out. Bail out. Neary tumbled through 20,000 feet of empty air, watching his fortress spiral down in flames, counting the parachutes that blossomed white against the smoke. Only 7 out of 10. He hit the ground hard in a farmer's field. Within an hour, Wehrmacht soldiers had him surrounded. Within a day, he was on a train. Within a week, he arrived at Stalag Luft III. The camp sat in the middle of nowhere, deliberately isolated. The Germans had chosen the location carefully. The soil was sandy, bright yellow sand that would show up immediately on the dark uniforms of anyone trying to tunnel out. The pine forest pressed in on all sides, dense and watchful. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter every 100 yards, searchlights sweeping the compound at night like the fingers of some mechanical god. 2 rows of barbed wire fences, 10 feet high, separated by a no-man's land patrolled by guards with dogs. And beyond the inner fence, 30 feet from the barracks, ran the warning wire. Cross that wire and the guards would shoot without hesitation. No questions, no warnings, just bullets. Neary shuffled through the gates with a dozen other new arrivals in August 1943. They were exhausted, hungry, scared. Most had been in the Luftwaffe's hands for days or weeks, interrogated at Stalag Luft, the transit camp where German intelligence officers tried to extract information. Some men had talked. Most hadn't, but all of them arrived at Stalag Luft III expecting the worst. They'd heard the stories. Concentration camps, gas chambers, mass executions. They were prisoners of the Third Reich, and they assumed that meant they were as good as dead. But something was different here. The guards who processed them wore Luftwaffe blue, not Wehrmacht gray. They were older men mostly, too old for combat flying. Some walked with limps. Others wore eye patches or had arms that hung stiffly at their sides. These were men who had flown in the First War or who had been shot down in this one. Pilots, navigators, gunners. Men who had fought in the same sky as the prisoners they now guarded. And that changed everything. The commandant of Stalag Luft III was Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindner-Wildau. A Prussian aristocrat from the old school, he'd served in the Kaiser's army in World War I. He was 61 years old when he took command of the camp, a career officer who believed in honor and discipline. He made his position clear from the first day. The prisoners were enemy combatants, yes, but they were also airmen. They had fought with courage. They deserved to be treated with respect. Von Lindner walked a razor's edge. Above him, the Nazi hierarchy demanded absolute control, absolute loyalty to the regime. Below him, his guards were Luftwaffe men who remembered the chivalry of the First War, who had shot down enemy aircraft and then searched for survivors to rescue. And in front of him were thousands of Allied airmen who would do anything to escape. The Americans arriving in 1943 and 1944 found a camp that defied their expectations. Yes, they were prisoners. Yes, they were behind wire. Yes, armed guards watched their every move. But they weren't beaten. They weren't starved. The guards didn't torture them for sport. Instead, they found a strange sort of normalcy. The barracks were wooden huts, each housing about 50 men in two-tier bunks. They had a library stocked with books from the Red Cross. They had a theater where prisoners put on plays and concerts. They even had a small sports field where they could play baseball or volleyball. The food was terrible, mostly watery soup and black bread, but Red Cross parcels supplemented their diet with chocolate, cigarettes, and canned goods. Men organized classes, teaching each other languages, mathematics, engineering. They created a miniature society behind the wire, a defiant assertion of humanity in the face of captivity. And the guards, they were professionals. Firm but fair. They conducted their roll calls twice a day, counting and recounting to make sure no one had escaped. They enforced the rules about the warning wire and the lights-out curfew. But they also turned a blind eye to minor infractions. They traded cigarettes for information about life in America. They showed photographs of their families. Some even expressed quiet doubts about the war, though never about Hitler directly. That would be too dangerous. The Gestapo had informers everywhere, even among the Luftwaffe guards. Captain James Wheeler arrived at Stalag Luft III in January 1944. His B-24 had been shot down over France, and he'd spent 3 weeks evading capture before the Gestapo caught him trying to cross into Spain. The interrogation at Stalag Luft had been intense. The Luftwaffe intelligence officer knew everything about his squadron, his base in England, even the name of his girlfriend back in Ohio. It was unnerving, but the officer had been polite, almost apologetic. "We're all just doing our jobs," he'd said. "You do the same to me." Wheeler had given only his name, rank, and serial number, and after a week they'd given up and sent him to the camp. His first night in the barracks, the other prisoners gathered around, hungry for news from the outside world. What's happening in the war? Are we winning? When will the invasion come? Wheeler told them what he knew, which wasn't much. The bombing campaign was intensifying. More and more aircraft were hitting German cities every day. The Luftwaffe was taking heavy losses, but so were the Allies. Every mission, men didn't come back. Every mission, the sky filled with fire and metal and death. The prisoners listened in silence. They knew. They'd all been there. They'd all seen friends die. They'd all felt the terror of flak bursting around them, of fighters diving out of the sun with guns blazing. One of the older prisoners, A British RAF officer named Squadron Leader Roger Bushell pulled Wheeler aside after the others had drifted off to their bunks. Bushell was the senior British officer in the camp, a South African-born pilot with a brilliant mind and an unshakable determination to escape. He'd already escaped twice from other camps, and he was planning something big here at Stalag Luft III, something audacious. He called it the Great Escape. "We're digging 3 tunnels," Bushell told Wheeler, Tom, Dick, and Harry. "We're going to get 200 men out in one night. We're going to embarrass the hell out of the Germans and tie up their resources searching for us." Wheeler looked at him like he was crazy. 200 men, through tunnels, in this sand. Bushell just smiled. "We've been working on it for months. We've got engineers, forgers, tailors. We're making civilian clothes, identity papers, train tickets. We've got men who speak fluent German. We're going to do this. And we need every able body we can get." The tunnels were marvels of engineering. The prisoners had sunk shafts 30 feet deep to get below the seismograph, microphones the Germans had planted around the camp. They'd shored up the tunnels with bed boards stolen from every barracks. They'd rigged electric lights by tapping into the camp's power supply. They'd built trolleys to move the sand and air pumps to keep the diggers from suffocating. And they disposed of tons of bright yellow sand by hiding it in bags sewn into their trousers, dispersing it around the camp during exercise periods. The guards called them penguins because of the way they waddled when their trouser legs were full of sand. But they never caught on to the full scale of the operation. The German guards weren't stupid. They knew the prisoners were trying to escape. That was expected. That was part of the game. The prisoners had a duty to try to escape, and the guards had a duty to stop them. But there was a mutual respect in how both sides played the game. The guards conducted searches of the barracks, but they gave warnings first, allowing the prisoners to hide their contraband. The prisoners built elaborate traps and hiding places, but they didn't attack the guards or try to kill them. It was a strange dance, this relationship between captor and captive, governed by unwritten rules that both sides understood. Oberfeldwebel Hermann Glemnitz was the head of the camp's security. A former fighter pilot who'd been shot down over England in 1940, he'd spent time as a POW himself, before being repatriated in a prisoner exchange. He knew what it was like on the other side of the wire. He knew the desperation, the boredom, the constant gnawing need to do something, anything, to fight back. So he respected the prisoners' efforts even as he worked tirelessly to thwart them. He was good at his job, very good. He discovered Tom Tunnel in September 1943, just weeks before it was due to be completed. The prisoners had been devastated, but they'd also been impressed. Glemnitz had figured out their dispersal system, tracked the sand, and found the entrance hidden under a stove in one of the barracks. He'd congratulated them on their ingenuity, then ordered the tunnel destroyed. But Glemnitz didn't know about Dick and Harry. The prisoners had learned from Tom's discovery. They'd become more careful, more cunning. Dick was eventually abandoned and used as a storage space for the tons of sand they were excavating from Harry. And Harry kept growing, foot by foot, yard by yard, stretching out under the wire under the forest toward freedom. Winter turned to spring. The war ground on. In the barracks at night, men listened to the BBC on illegal radios they'd built from scrounged parts. The news was mixed. The Soviets were pushing west, driving the Wehrmacht back across the steppes. The bombing campaign over Germany was reaching a crescendo, with thousand-bomber raids turning cities into infernos. But the invasion of France, the second front that everyone knew was coming, kept getting delayed. The prisoners marked time, counting the days, wondering if they'd still be behind wire when the war finally ended. And then came June 6, 1944, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But the prisoners at Stalag Luft III didn't know. Their illegal radios had been discovered in a sweep the week before. The Germans had tightened security after discovering Harry Tunnel in March, just hours before the planned escape. 76 men had gotten out before the guards found the exit in the woods. Only 3 had made it to freedom. 50 had been murdered by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct orders, shot in the back of the head and cremated, their ashes returned to the camp in urns. The massacre had shocked everyone, prisoners and guards alike. It was a violation of every rule of war, every code of honor. The Luftwaffe guards had been horrified. Some had wept openly. Von Lindner had been relieved of command and arrested for allowing the escape to happen. The new commandant was a hard man, a Nazi party member who didn't share his predecessor's respect for the prisoners. So when the invasion happened, the prisoners had no way of knowing. They saw the guards whispering among themselves, saw the tension in their faces, but they didn't know why. The war could have ended. The Germans could have surrendered. Or the invasion could have failed, the Allies thrown back into the sea. The uncertainty was torture. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter had been a guard at Stalag Luft III for 18 months. He was 38 years old, a former Luftwaffe mechanic who'd been invalided out of active service after a bomber he was working on had exploded, leaving him partially deaf in his left ear. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, with a wife and 2 daughters back in Hamburg. He'd seen photographs of what the Allied bombers were doing to German cities. He knew his family was living in a basement, emerging only when the all-clear sounded, never knowing if their home would still be standing. He hated the bombers. He hated the men who flew them, but he also respected them. They were doing their duty just as he was doing his. They were brave men, flying into hell every night, knowing that many of them wouldn't come back. How could he not respect that? Richter had watched the prisoners carefully over the months. He'd seen how they organized themselves, how they took care of each other, how they never gave up hope. He'd seen men receive letters telling them their wives had left them, their children had died, their homes had been destroyed. And he'd seen those same men pick themselves up the next day and keep going. It was humbling. These were not the subhuman monsters that Goebbels' propaganda described. These were men, good men, men who loved their families and missed their homes and wanted nothing more than for the war to end so they could go back to their lives. On the morning of June 7, Richter was on duty in the compound, walking the perimeter between the barracks. The prisoners were out for their morning exercise, playing volleyball, jogging around the warning wire, sitting in small groups talking. The sun was warm. The sky was blue. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that made you forget, just for a moment, that there was a war on. Richter paused near a group of American officers who were sitting on the steps of their barracks. He recognized them, Captain Wheeler, Lieutenant Neary, a half-dozen others whose names he didn't know. They looked up as he approached, their conversation dying away. The relationship between guards and prisoners was always complicated. Not quite hostile, but not friendly either. Wary, watchful, Richter glanced around. The nearest guard tower was 100 yards away. The other guards were scattered across the compound, too far to hear. He took a deep breath. What he was about to do could get him shot. The Gestapo had made it clear after the escape. Any guard who showed sympathy to the prisoners, who gave them information, who helped them in any way, would be treated as a traitor. And traitors faced the firing squad. But Richter was tired, tired of the war, tired of the death, tired of the lies. These men deserved to know. They deserved to have hope. He stepped closer to the group, close enough that he could speak quietly. The prisoners tensed. Was this a search, an interrogation? Richter met Wheeler's eyes. He spoke in heavily accented English, his voice barely above a whisper. The invasion has begun. The words hung in the air for a moment, not quite registering. Then Wheeler's eyes went wide. What? Richter nodded. Yesterday, Normandy. The Americans and British have landed in France. It has begun. And then he turned and walked away, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He'd done it. He'd crossed the line. There was no going back now. Behind him, the prisoners sat in stunned silence. Then Wheeler let out a whoop that echoed across the compound. Neary grabbed his arm. Shut up. You'll get us all in trouble. But Wheeler couldn't contain himself. Don't you understand? It's happening, the invasion. We're going home. The other prisoners nearby heard the commotion and came running. What's going on? What happened? Wheeler told them, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. A guard just told me. The invasion started yesterday. Normandy. We've landed in France. The news spread through the compound like wildfire. Within minutes, every prisoner knew. Men laughed, men cried. Men embraced each other, dancing in the sand. The guards watched from the towers, confused by the sudden celebration. They didn't know that one of their own had just given the prisoners the greatest gift imaginable: hope. But why had Richter done it? He asked himself that question 1,000 times in the days that followed. Was it compassion? Was it a belief that the war was lost and he wanted to be on the right side when it ended? Was it simply exhaustion, a momentary lapse in judgment? He didn't know. All he knew was that when he'd looked into Wheeler's eyes, he'd seen himself. A man far from home. A man who missed his family. A man who wanted the war to end. And in that moment, the uniforms hadn't mattered. The flags hadn't mattered. They were just two men, sharing a moment of humanity in the midst of madness. The days after D-Day were electric with tension. The prisoners waited for news, any news, about how the invasion was going. Were the Allies holding the beaches? Were they pushing inland? Or had the Germans driven them back into the sea? The new commandant had cut off all access to information. No newspapers, no radio broadcasts. The prisoners were left to speculate, to hope, to pray. Some of the guards, emboldened by Richter's example, began to whisper snippets of news as they passed. The Allies are advancing. The Germans are retreating. It won't be long now. But other guards, loyal Nazis who believed in the Führer's promise of final victory, became more brutal. They conducted surprise searches, confiscated Red Cross parcels, threw men into the cooler for minor infractions. The camp became a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Richter kept his head down. He didn't speak to the prisoners again. He couldn't risk it, but he watched them, saw how his 4 words had transformed them. They stood taller. They smiled more. They had hope. And that hope sustained them through the long summer months as the war raged on. In August, Paris was liberated. In September, the Allies crossed into Germany itself. The end was in sight, but it was still months away, and those months would be the hardest of all. As the Soviet army approached from the east, the Germans began evacuating the camps. In January 1945, with temperatures well below zero, the prisoners at Stalag Luft III were ordered to march west. 10,000 men, weak from years of captivity, trudged through the snow in one of the coldest winters on record. Many died on the march. Many more barely survived. The Luftwaffe guards marched with them, as much prisoners of circumstance as the men they guarded. Richter was among them, his feet wrapped in rags, his stomach empty, his body pushed beyond endurance. He marched beside Wheeler at one point, the two men too exhausted to speak, but acknowledging each other with a nod. They'd both survived this far. They'd both make it to the end. They had to. The war ended in May 1945. The prisoners were liberated by advancing Allied forces. They were flown home, reunited with their families, given medals and parades. They tried to return to normal life, but normal was gone. They'd been changed by their experience, marked by the years behind wire. Some thrived. Others struggled. All of them carried the memories of Stalag Luft III for the rest of their lives, and many of them, in the quiet moments, thought about the German guards who had treated them with respect, who had shown them humanity when they could have shown them cruelty, who had risked their lives to give them hope. Richter survived the war. He returned to Hamburg to find his home destroyed, his wife and daughters living in a refugee camp. Germany was in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, its people starving and broken. He never spoke about his time as a guard at Stalag Luft III. It was too complicated, too painful. He'd been on the wrong side of history, wearing the uniform of a regime that had committed unimaginable atrocities. But he'd also done what he could, in his small way, to maintain his humanity. He'd treated his prisoners with respect. He'd given them hope when they had none. And in the end, perhaps that was all any man could do. Decades later, in the 1970s, a reunion was held for the survivors of Stalag Luft III. Former prisoners came from all over the world, gathering to remember their fallen comrades and to share their stories. And some of them invited their former guards. Richter was among those invited. He almost didn't go. What would they think of him? Would they hate him? Would they blame him for their suffering? But his daughter convinced him, "You have to go, Papa. You have to face your past." So he went, an old man now, his hair white, his body bent with age. And when he walked into the room, Wheeler was there. The two men stared at each other across the decades. Then Wheeler crossed the room and embraced him. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for giving us hope." Richter wept. He'd carried the weight of those years for so long, the guilt and the shame and the confusion. And in that moment it lifted. Not completely. It would never be completely gone, but enough. Enough to let him breathe. The story of Stalag Luft III is not a simple story of good versus evil. It's a story of men caught in circumstances beyond their control, trying to maintain their humanity in the face of inhumanity. The prisoners who were held there suffered. They lost years of their lives. They lost friends. Some lost their lives in the Great Escape Massacre. But they also found something unexpected, respect from their enemies. The Luftwaffe guards who ran the camp were not monsters. They were men who had fought in the same sky as their prisoners, who understood the courage it took to climb into a bomber or a fighter and face death every day. They treated their prisoners with the same respect they would have wanted if the roles were reversed. And that respect, that basic human decency, made all the difference. It didn't end the war. It didn't stop the killing. But it reminded everyone involved that even in the darkest times, humanity can survive. That even between enemies, there can be honor. That the bonds forged in shared experience can transcend the artificial divisions of nationality and ideology. The men who fought in the skies over Europe, whether they wore American leather or German blue, understood something that the politicians and generals never could. Up there, among the clouds, they were all the same. They were all airmen. They all knew the terror and the exhilaration of flight. They all knew what it meant to look death in the face and keep flying. And that shared experience created a bond that even war couldn't break. Richter's 4 words, whispered on a June morning in 1944, were more than just information. They were an acknowledgement of that bond, a recognition that the men behind the wire were not just prisoners, but fellow airmen who deserved to know that the tide was turning, that their sacrifice had not been in vain, that they would go home. And in giving them that hope, Richter risked everything. He could have been shot. He could have been sent to the Eastern Front. He could have been handed over to the Gestapo and disappeared into the night and fog of the Nazi terror state. But he did it anyway, because in that moment, his humanity was more important than his fear. That's the real story of Stalag Luft III. Not the tunnels or the escapes or even the massacre, but the moments of connection between men who should have been enemies but found, instead, a shared humanity. The guard who whispered news of the invasion. The commandant who insisted his prisoners be treated with respect. The prisoners who mourned when their guards were punished for the escape. These small acts of decency, these tiny rebellions against the dehumanization of war, are what we should remember, because they remind us that even in the worst of times, we have a choice. We can choose cruelty or we can choose compassion. We can choose to see our enemies as monsters, or we can choose to see them as men. The airmen of Stalag Luft III, both prisoners and guards, made that choice. And in doing so, they showed us that honor between enemies is not just possible, but necessary. That the codes we live by, the values we hold, must survive even when everything else is falling apart. That's the legacy of Stalag Luft III. Not just the great escape, but the great example of what it means to remain human in inhuman times.